There is a growing concern that global index funds have a problem.
They're worried about that concentration of the Magnificent Seven.
The investors buying these products in search of wide diversification are achieving the exact opposite. And you know, this problem's pretty easy to wrap your head around. I mean, just take a look around. How many pieces of tech are within arm's reach of you right now? What do all these remotes do? And why do 30 million people tune in to watch these?
One more thing, the iPad. How did we fit a Mac in here?
The old school Microsoft ones were way better.
Developers.
We live in a land of giants. Massive mega corporations with revenues that rival countries. One conglomerate has cartel-like control over communication. And there's a business over here that has literally redefined what it means to look for shit.
Google it, mate.
Not only are we reliant on tech, but the tech that we hold so dear is provided by a handful of companies. And that trend is reflected every single time you invest in a global index.
They are completely dominating this game.
I want to take you back to December 2009. This is the top 10 businesses you would get if you purchased a global index. They were massive. They represented 9% of the total value of the whole index. 9p in every pound you invested went straight to these guys. 3 of them were technology businesses. But fast forward to today, and the 10 largest companies are now 22% of the index. 1/4 of the whole value. 22p in every pound you invest in the global economy goes to these businesses. And look at this list. Can you spot anything else different? 8 of them are now tech businesses. We can throw Tesla in there as well, because if they crack FSD, they are very much a tech business. There are 2 problems really here. Over-investing in a specific sector, the tech sector, then an over-reliance on just a few companies within that sector. 7 to be precise. Fidelity claims that last year the Magnificent Seven by December 2023 had risen a total of 70%. It's much more than that by the end of the year. But global markets without them have produced a poor, in comparison, 10% return. The whole thing that these articles are discussing that they're arguing is prevalent in the market today reminds me of this story about the prepared farmer. Let's just call him Tom. He had bad experiences in the past with crops, spent all year growing wheat for it just to die and be left with nothing. But this time, Tom was smart. He was diversified. In each of his fields, he planted a different crop. So if one crop died, he would be okay. Nothing could wipe him out completely. He had spread his risk, similar in a way to a global investor. The day came to harvest his crops, and great news, all of them were doing well. Tom was buzzing. He jumps into his tractor, turns the key, and it doesn't start. In an instant, Tom the farmer realised what was going on. What looked like a well-diversified plan was heavily reliant on one piece of tech. And what the farmer didn't account for was, if that piece of tech failed, his whole plan was ruined. As global or even S&P 500 investors for that matter, should we be worried about our tech failing, about these titans of today fading away and what that would do to our portfolios? I mean, let's first of all just acknowledge that given enough time, these businesses will fail. If we go back to 1955, only 52 of the companies that were in the Fortune 500 then are still here today. So 89% of the largest businesses in America over that time period have either gone bankrupt, merged, been purchased, or just faded into obscurity. Disruption and innovation is a constant in the business world, and the speed at which companies are falling is accelerating. If we look at the S&P 500, which is where our tech titans all reside, in 1965, corporations stayed on this list for an average of about 33 years. By 1990, it was just 20 years. And it's forecast now to narrow even further to 14 years by 2026. So that means half of the businesses, half of the firms that make up the S&P 500 index today will be replaced by 2032. We must accept as investors that the companies we invest in will fail. It's that sort of humility really that makes me buy a broad index, because I'm not smart enough to know what industry is about to be turned on its head. But it does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it, in a way, that as an index investor, we can just buy everything and still make money, still do okay. I've referred to the work of Henrik Bessenbinder before in his landmark study into the returns of the stock market. He's recently updated his study, and he found that the 28,114 companies that made up the American market between 1926 and 2022, that produced 55.1 trillion in wealth for investors over that time, 58.5% of those companies reduced your wealth rather than increasing it. You got all these different companies, but it was just a handful that actually did what you need. So we know that businesses fade in relevance, but in today's market, does the sheer size of the tech sector and the concentration of that sector in the hands of a few companies put us at risk? Research from Wealth Club, one of the people pointing out this issue, stated themselves, this increased concentration could be putting investors' funds at risk through a lack of diversification. This right here is a fantastic chart. I need to get out more. It shows the relative size of the most dominant sector in the market over time, stretching back to the 1800s. The technology sector right here in dark blue is about the same size as the energy sector was at its height in the mid-1950s. Energy is no longer the dominant sector, but between 1950 and 2023, an investment in the global markets has produced a pre-inflation return of around 11%. The truth is, historically speaking, that one sector always dominates, and that's tech right now. It's not unique, and it's not even that big relatively speaking either. Look at the dominance of real estate and finance in the 1800s. Okay, but the sheer size of these businesses must be a concern, right? Apple alone is bigger than the whole of the UK stock market. Here's another chart produced by Goldman Sachs again that shows this is not unique. The largest company in an index has often belonged to the largest and most relevant sector of the time, and their size has often dwarfed that of other companies. General Motors in the 50s and 60s was bigger relative to a percentage size of the S&P 500 than Apple is today. If Best & Binder's work continues to show us that most businesses fail to produce a return, shouldn't it be expected then that the businesses that do produce the return of the market will be massive relative to the others, in order to counteract the fact that the majority underperform? As Swedish pop supergroup ABBA once said, the winner takes it all. Big dominant businesses are not unusual, but what is unusual is not the presence of a dominant sector or a dominant company within that sector, but this trend that we have today of a couple of businesses, a handful, 7 in this case, being huge compared to the rest of the market. The 10 largest companies now have reached over 30% of the market value of the S&P 500. So concerningly, there's been 2 other points throughout history, 1973 and the year 2000, where we've had this level of concentration, and what followed was a prolonged and painful bear market, a downturn in the values of portfolios. But there are other examples of high concentration markets like this one that we have now, 8 to be exact. But in 5 of those 7, not including today's, the market continued to rise in the year following the peak in dominance. So even though the biggest companies had peaked and started to decline in their dominance relative to the whole market, the market found a way to go up. Why, and how does that apply to today? If we go back to the most recent lows of the S&P 500, you'd be looking at about October 2022. We can then trace the performance of the Magnificent 7 since then, and then the other 493 companies that make up this list, and then the overall performance of the index itself. You can see the impact the dominance of these businesses has had on the overall average, dragging the performance up. But you can also see that prior to, say, October last year, the remaining businesses in the index, tiny inconsequential companies like JP Morgan, Visa, Johnson & Johnson and Walmart, had not really recovered on aggregate from the low point of 2022. Not meaningfully anyway in comparison to our titans. But since then they've started to rise significantly. As the mainstream media do nothing but focus on the Magnificent 7, the other 493 companies that make up the S&P 500, and with it a large part of the global market, have been steadily rising. It's this impact that in the past has meant that the relevance of the biggest businesses could fade, but markets would still trend upwards. Call it a lagged effect. We could point to Tesla as an isolated example of this. The worst performing company in the S&P 500 over 12 months was the best performing not so long ago. And as it slipped, the market as a whole has still found a way to go up significantly. The other constituents in the portfolio can rise and prop up the returns of the market as a whole. Sasha did some good analysis on this point, and I'll link his video at the end cards of this one if you want to go further into this topic. But I see articles like this claiming the success of tech businesses is a bad thing for global investors. And honestly, I just think those who state this either haven't looked at the past or have ulterior motives. Wealth Club, who are a contributor to this article, offer a portfolio service where they select investments for clients. So of course they're going to come out and go, oh, by the way, we think passive investing is at risk. I'll be fair and say that the tone of this article in particular suggests really that this tech dominance is a concern for those with shorter investing timelines. I think recent headlines that tech CEOs are selling off shares have also sparked concerns that we're near the top of a market and may see a correction in these large tech companies. We've seen as a result of this a rise in the popularity of equally weighted indexes. A market-weighted index, which is what most people, including myself, use, the money goes to the biggest businesses when you buy. So as an example, in a global index, about 5p in every pound that you invest goes to Apple because they're one of the biggest businesses. In an equally weighted index, every company on the list gets the same amount of money. It's equally weighted. Research from the street found that over the past 20 years, the returns of the cap-weighted and equal weight S&P 500 index funds have virtually been identical. But the equal weight index has taken 15% more risk to achieve the same return. Its deepest drawdown, so how much it's fallen, has been greater, and risk-adjusted performance has been weaker. For me personally, I have no interest in switching from market to equal weighting, trying to guess which will outperform. I believe this defeats the whole point of index investing, and really is just a version of market timing. This trend of dominance of companies and sectors has historically always been the case. I focused on America here because if you're saying global funds are too concentrated, well, 65% of the concentration is in America, so it makes sense to focus on that market. But let's say you go, forget America, I'm going to invest in the rest of the world instead. European markets have followed the same trend, a rise in dominance of the 10 biggest stocks, and also to a degree so is Japan. The trend for Japan here is not as pronounced because the topics contains over 2,000 companies, so that waters down the dominance of the top 10. But this trend of the biggest businesses increasing in dominance is a global one that's been panning out for centuries. It's just this big cycle. As innovation disrupts industries, companies rise and become giants, only to one day be disrupted themselves. But through it all, a consistent approach into a globally diversified portfolio has produced significant returns for investors. And I honestly don't see that changing anytime soon. I think articles like this and the research they quote are produced by active fund managers who make a living convincing people this is super hard and scary and that you need their help to navigate the market. It's a convincing message that tech is too dominant, that plays into our own insecurities that we're becoming far too reliant on devices. But consider this. Since the first human banged a rock against something to crack it open over 3 million years ago, tech has been rising.
Yes!
We say tech today and we think of AI and this robot facing the same coffee pod frustrations we do. But cars, planes, wind-up radios, shampoos, the printing press, seed drills, barbed wire, sliced bread at one point were all considered cutting-edge technology. We say tech as if it's this newfangled thing. I would argue every business is a technology business at heart. This list that people are so worried about is just reflective of the digitalization of all of our lives and the services that make up them. Because when I look at this, I don't see tech companies. I see a library, a consumer goods business, a retailer, a car company, a place to chat to your mates, and a manufacturer. Is the global stock market over-reliant on just a few businesses? Yes, but that's always been the case. Has technology become a dominant trend in investing? Yes, but technology has been a dominant trend of the human species since day one. Right, this channel's boring now. What else is on? It's the wrong remote. Okay. Hello. So there's something that's happened recently I would like to tell you about. Over the last year or so, CEOs and other business leaders have been approaching me asking for help with their people's finances. Basically things like explaining company pensions and how to budget and invest. So I've started a business to help more people improve their finances, but through their companies. I can come into your workplace and give talks, custom videos, and answer your biggest money questions. If this sounds like something that you might benefit from, or the people at your company, please get in touch through this email that's on screen now and we can explain more. It honestly doesn't matter what your role is or who you are in the business. If you think that we could help you and your colleagues, we want to hear from you. Nothing but bloody adverts.